Welcome to Natural Resources University. This week's episode features Deer University, hosted by Bronson Strickland and Steve Damaris.
Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count. Welcome back to the Deer University podcast. I'm Bronson Strickland, and I'm joined today by the infamous
Steve Damaris.
Steve Damaris, yeah.
Yes. I wasn't sure if you'd forgotten my name, so I was just being clear.
Well, Steve, today we are going to take the opportunity to, follow up on some listener feedback. Someone that's been listening to the podcast, I think their comment was something like, you spend a lot of time talking about buck harvest, but you haven't spent an equivalent amount of time talking about doe harvest, and why is it even necessary? How many should you harvest? How do you know how many to harvest, etc.? Mm-hmm. So we thought we'd spend a little time today going on down that road.
Yeah, and in fact, in bigger context, we spend even more time talking about habitat management, and that's critically important. But population management is actually the harder portion of the pie of management tools that you have to apply. It's relatively easy to manage plants that are staying in one place. It's much more challenging to manage animals that are roaming hundreds and thousands of acres, and then you have the much less known quantity of hunters that are looking at that animal, and are they all seeing the same thing? And boy, that can really get dicey.
Yeah. And let me potentially not just clarify something you said.
Please do.
They're not roaming hundreds of thousands of acres.
No.
Hundreds or
yes.
Thousands of acres.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I guess I more or less agree that it's certainly a challenge. Population management is certainly a challenge. But I think habitat management is still a challenge for a lot of people as well. And I think what you were maybe meaning is the practical side of it. The habitat is there and it's not going anywhere.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Whereas the population's a moving target year to year.
That's right. And, a lot of our listeners have grown up, they understand shooting a deer. So maybe the population side can be easier, and we're trying to get them to go out and light a match and run a chainsaw and understand succession. So yeah, I get that. Your counterpoint is habitat management can be pretty challenging, especially if you don't own your land and, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of things going on there. But yeah, so none of it's easy.
See, I felt that I needed to offer a counterpoint because throughout my career, every time I think I have said something that is irrefutable, it's just, this is the law of the land, Steve Damaris typically comes in with a however.
Well, thank you for apologies, I guess, for always sticking in the however, but thank you for putting in the counterpoint.
Let's see. Well, okay. Well, why don't we start with the very basics of why is population control even needed? And given your this could be a little bit of a dig, but it's not intended to be, the long-spanning career that you have had.
The vast knowledge that I've come to accumulate.
The decade upon decade upon decade upon decade of career experience.
Well, maybe there might be one extra in there somewhere, but
no, it's there, trust me. Why don't you go through, let's say, 20 plus years ago, the state of population control? Because it's certainly changed over the past decade or two.
Yeah, and I can speak to that generational change in approaches to management. And when I was in undergraduate school and graduate school, it was at the kind of the tail end of the deer restoration efforts in the Southeast in particular. And populations had been, kind of restored during the 40s and 50s and early 60s. And so the numbers were coming back very strongly at that point. And so when I was in school, we were learning about convincing and educating hunters to just harvest does as part of their management scheme, that they weren't used to doing that because does had been protected for decades while they were being restored. But once you get to that level of adequacy of numbers, then you start having to control those numbers. And so we entered a decade or more of teaching hunters to harvest does. And there were a lot of incentive programs. The DMAP program which was started here at Mississippi State as a cooperative research project with Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks, and subsequently distributed across the southeast and eastern U.S. for a lot of different state agencies. So after it was distributed across the southeast and much of the eastern United States, it is the go-to tool for collecting data, and part of the incentive of that was, the agencies wanted data from harvested deer, and the carrot that they provided to the landowners and the hunters is, all right, we're going to provide you management expertise, management input on how many and what type of deer to harvest, but also you got deer tags, doe tags in particular, and so you could, in any given property, say there's 10 hunters, 3 or 4 of them are gung-ho hunters. The other ones are kind of, I like to go out and sit on the stand and maybe shoot a deer. And when you're trying to control a population, you can't get enough killed by just the 3. So those doe tags early on, 30 years ago, allowed the gung-ho hunters to harvest over their bag limit.
Right.
So it was a facilitating carrot to get them to do the right thing. And we did a really good job teaching hunters to do that. And then we started in the really late 80s, early 90s, starting to talk about protecting younger bucks and managing the age classes of the buck population. So then we had to teach people, you can shoot does, but let's not shoot the first legal buck that comes along and why that might make sense. So we've gone through these transitions, and thank you for reminding me how many of those transitions I've been around for. And really we're now at a position where we've been 40 years in the Southeast with really fully restored deer populations. And it's a mature deer population and habitat that, we could argue, we could have a conversation with 10 different biologists and we'd all have a different opinion on just how much impact there's been on the existing habitat and has it degraded over time. And certainly there have been changes because of those 30 or 40 years where you've got as many deer as you can handle and maybe more.
Yeah. And just to your point here, and see, I can make age-related jokes, but I do know that, I'm not very far behind you. So you can spin it right back on me. But I was giving a seminar just the other day, and it was regarding the history of wildlife management and so forth. And it's, people that are going to be 20 years younger than me. And they come into deer hunting not remembering what you lived through and what I lived through, where it was a novelty to see a deer. I mean, you couldn't send a text back then, but you would certainly call someone with all this excitement that you had finally seen a deer.
Sure.
I remember seeing my very first deer track, how big of a deal that was. And back when people read newspapers, when a deer was harvested, it would make the newspaper, so we're just in a completely different context now.
Yes.
With the number of deer we have. And so the bottom line is that the populations in most cases need to be controlled.
Yes, and the basic reason there's a finite supply of resources, nutrients available, and a lot of hunters and landowners they look out and they see a lot of green on their property, and everything green is not deer food, and we've pushed that in our books and writings and on earlier podcasts as well. So everything that's green is not good deer food, and if you look at even the good species of plants that generally are acceptable forage, if they're stopped growing 3 months ago, the leaf quality, the nutrient quality is going downhill fast. So there's a finite supply of nutrients. And I did an informal survey some years ago of private lands biologists here in the Southeast, and that asked them of all the properties, and that's what they do for a living, is they go on and help people manage deer populations and their habitat. I said, of all the properties you've gone on in some whatever amount of time frame, however old they were, what percentage of them are in really good shape nutritionally from the standpoint of nutritional carrying capacity? And they said over 90% of them don't have adequate nutritional intake available for their deer population. 9 out of 10 or more properties don't have enough food. And there's only two things you can do to fix that.
Right.
Fix the habitat.
Fix the deer population.
Or fix the deer population. And, generally people listen to us, they realize we're talking about fixing both simultaneously. So you don't want to just do one thing, but they're both part of the puzzle.
Okay, so here's one more little tidbit. Just as an example of how a population can grow, this is something that we have, you and I both have taught, is we have a slide from the data from the George Reserve deer herd, the George McCullough experiments in that book, classic
way
book.
up there in Michigan.
Up there in Michigan, yeah. And I don't remember the exact starting numbers, but I'm pretty sure it was one time they started with 5 deer, and one time they started with 8 deer. And in just 8 years later, in both those cases, they had over 200 deer in that enclosure.
Yeah.
And so that's just, and of course, there was no hunting going on. There was most likely no predation that we're aware of going on. But that just shows the capacity of the population to build in a decade without the proper harvesting.
Yeah. So harvesting is a tool. It's an important tool. And hopefully a lot of our audience has seen our videos. And one of our effective videos a few years back was me showing how much food a deer ate.
Right.
In a given day. 200-pound deer, I think it was.
Yeah.
And it's really amazing how much quality food as well as quantity food they need.
Yeah.
So it's important that there be enough of it. So habitat management is important. Population management is important. You got to remove excess animals, otherwise you blow up population.
Populations grow, the amount of quality food, at first the amount of quality food available per deer, and then eventually just food per deer. But the response of the deer herd is going to be diminished quality and diminished numbers at some point. Quality will respond first, and we're thinking body weight, antler size. And then eventually the number of fawns that are surviving. That is where the population will start limiting itself to some degree.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so all we're trying to do is head that off. We don't want a population to be food limited where it will limit itself, or we got a bunch of unhealthy deer.
Yeah, because that is the result of the limitation.
Right.
The deer are really great at surviving and getting by. And there's a big range of variation between just getting by and what you really want in a healthy deer population.
Exactly. And they need to have all they can eat to fulfill their genetic potential. Okay, so let's go with, I guess, more directly with the listener's question is, how do we determine this? Now, I guess I'll start, Steve, with this is where, since you brought up DMAP or the Deer Management Assistance Program, this is a wonderful opportunity for a landowner or hunter to work with a state agency wildlife biologist or a consultant that's going to have a lot of experience in that area. They're going to have a good feel for what it's going to require to maintain that population. But if you're on your own and you don't have those opportunities available to you, how do you start? What metrics are you looking for? How do you read into, I need to harvest more?
Yeah, there's several indicators, and if you think about when you go for your annual checkup at the doctor, they're going to take your blood pressure and measure your height and your weight and look at your, what was that ratio of weight to height?
Yeah, body mass index.
Yeah,
right?
body mass index and things like that. And, of course, in humans, we want a lower body mass index because we don't want a lot of fat in our bodies. But when we evaluate condition of wildlife, we're often looking for fatter animals. And so there's things that we measure in harvested animals that allow us to determine what condition they're in. One of those is just straight out body mass, field dressed body mass. We can do things like kidney fat index as an indicator of fat specifically. And really, I like to look at specific age classes of animals for specific metrics, like body weight of a 3-year-old and older does. I don't really even look at that. I like to look at yearling does body weights because they're the most recently impacted by the nutrition available over the last 2 years, and they haven't yet started being impacted by the production of fawns. And some of our research in the past has shown that a doe that loses her fawns 1 year will be heavier the next year because she didn't have that lactation demand. So as soon as you start messing with, adult does, body weights, you've got, well, did she bring 2 fawns off or just 1 fawn off, or did she lose both fawns? And then that composition of that sample gets all wiggly and doesn't necessarily show you what you want. But those yearling does, they were fawns the previous year, and they're going to breed this fall. But what's their condition going into that first breeding season?
Well, I'm going to agree and disagree.
Please do.
I agree with everything you said about yearling does being a more sensitive indicator. I would say for the reasons you mentioned, but I would also say in a hunting club scenario where they've got a really big sample of does year in, year out, I'm talking 20, 30, 40, 100 sometimes, I still think that's a very worthwhile indicator of where the trend is going. Now, what I think with those 3.5 or older does, to me, what is more meaningful is, and this is something most people don't capture, is the amount of carcass fat that is on them. And typically at the skinning shed, you look at it and you make a remark. Man, look at all the fat on, man, look, you can grab a handful. We say things like that, but most people don't record it via data. And so that's something I've been emphasizing to a lot of people. Just give me on a scale of 1 to 5 carcass condition. 1 being, and we've all been in that situation too, where we've taken the hide off and it's hard to find any fat whatsoever. We know they're in poor condition. Just mark on the data sheet, low, medium, high, bad, average, good, something like that is telling, I believe. And so I think in that case with a 3.5 or older doe, that does give you insight, just like that yearling doe for the previous few months or the previous year. But I completely agree because of the things we've talked about many, many times, the epigenetic type effect that doe's body weight is also related to her body size, her skeletal structure, and some of that can be based on her mother's condition, and it may not be based on a recent habitat condition. So we're not disagreeing; we're just augmenting,
qualifying, and that's what we have to do all the time. It depends when this, but that.
Right.
So we're not necessarily disagreeing; we're just qualifying for the listeners.
So in that regard, Steve, I'll give you my 2 cents. I'll give you my recommendation, and I'm going to give you the chance now to say, however, and you can correct me. I find it very difficult. There are, if someone to say, hey, I've got 300 acres, and should I be harvesting doe, or about how many, is unless I am really familiar with the property, or they have been collecting some type of data that gives me insight to go, holy smokes, there is a serious food limitation problem, and here's a number to start with. I typically err on the side of being conservative and monitor, meaning I saw you.
Well, conservative in regards to not harvesting too many, or conservative in protecting the nutritional availability and harvesting more?
But that's a good point. I was saying harvesting too many.
Okay, you prefer to go heavier and then back off?
No, I typically go a lighter amount of harvest and monitor, because I'm wanting to every year more until the data start telling us now you're making a change.
Yeah.
And then, and a lot of that, this would be very difficult to do on a small property because you're so influenced by the deer population around you and dispersal onto it.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't want someone to have a bad experience the next year because they over harvested. And again, on a small property, that would likely never happen.
Good point. And I don't disagree with that at all. On properties that I've worked with over the years, I do incrementally increase the harvest, because at some point you're going to reach this, heck no, we can't take any more. This is as much as, so you don't want to burn them out up front by saying harvest this many, and they can't even imagine doing that. So you have to incrementally increase over time.
I guess the exception would be, or not the exception, but relative to what I said earlier, the more experience you had with the property, and if you really knew, man, the body weights of these animals are 20 pounds below, let's say, the regional average, then I would be a lot more empowered in that case to go with a heavier harvest. I mean, jumping, you got a problem, and the quicker you get some deer off the landscape, the better you're going to be.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point too, is relativity. And a state like Mississippi that has a huge database of harvested animals for each of the soil resource regions, we can look at a property's body weights and say, okay, how does this compare to the regional average, the soil resource region on average? You say this property is above average or below average, so it gives you, that first look is how serious of a problem is there, and how hard do we have to get after it.
Okay, so you and I are saying that we are using the deer's carcass, or the metrics we're collecting from harvest data is one way to gauge how many.
Yeah.
The other way, if you're trained and know what you're looking for, and specifically if you're trained in the area of interest, the forest community, etc., I wouldn't be good at assessing deer habitat quality in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
I mean, I could tell if it's really, really bad, but I would need to spend some time there. But the other way of doing this is a walk through the woods if you know what you're looking for.
That's right.
Worst case scenario, there's a browse line across the whole property.
Yep. That's one of those indicators. And I think that's what a lot of the private lands biologists that I did that survey for is they go out on a property, they might just spend one day walking around, driving around, and so they're not sampling the deer per se that day, they're sampling the habitat. And that tells us a lot.
Yeah.
Relatively speaking, how bad is it?
Okay, Steve, so we've discussed kind of, I guess it's going to be always an annual assessment of where you're at with the deer herd. You can be looking at the habitat and how it's responding. Oh, we failed to mention your food plots are a good indicator.
Yeah.
If your numbers are out of balance.
If you can't grow a food plot.
Grow a food plot, or assuming you have enough acreage of food plots, Yeah, if the difference between outside the exclusion cage and inside is a really big deal, that tells you you're feeding a lot of deer, and so you might want to consider. And then of course the carcass is going to respond. Next year, year after, that's going to be a 2 to 3 year response, but the carcass condition is going to change. And as you pointed out too, age structure of the doe harvest is going to change. That's what a lot of our biologists look at.
Yeah.
Is if 90% of the doe harvest is made up of 3.5+ year old does, there's a lot of deer out there. There's a lot of old deer out there, and so you need to harvest.
You're not harvesting enough.
Yeah. Okay, so now here's a curveball for you, Steve. But you've had this curveball thrown at you many, many, many times. So have I. When's the best time to harvest?
Yeah, well,
early season, mid season, late season. Is there a strategy involved here?
I guess that really depends on where you are in your stage of management. And if you're early in a stage of management where you have just not enough food and a bunch of deer, I don't care when you harvest them. If it's, and our friend Carl Miller used to say, if it's brown, it goes down. And, just put them on the ground. Mm-hmm. But a lot of, we've been asked a bunch of times at different seminars and workshops and such, and, I want to have all my does on my property during the breeding season so the bucks will be on there, and we do all our doe harvest after the hunting season. Well, my response to that is, yeah, but what happens if you have some bad weather, gets really warm, or really, really bad cold and snow, and you don't go out and hunt and you don't harvest them? Mm-hmm. I'd rather have the does removed early and get it out of the way. So then during the breeding season, you can focus just on buck hunting.
Yeah.
You're not going to kill all the does. At most, a heavy doe harvest is 30 to 35% of the does on the property. Mm-hmm. Well, you still got 65 to 70% of the does out there. There's going to be some does available to be bred by bucks. Bucks are going to be on your property. And some would argue that the intensity of that breeding is greater because you have fewer does, and so the available bucks are more concentrated on the does.
Yeah.
And so it's, the day you see 8 bucks chasing a doe through a food plot like I did one day. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was so cool.
Yeah.
A whole line of them, just one after the other, chasing this doe that ran through the food plot.
So I completely agree. I think we end up with, what is the textbook perfect case scenario, and then what is the practical side of it. So let's say that the number of deer on your property were not degrading the food supply. And let's just make it even real simple here and just say food plots. Of course, we don't want our deer reliant on food plots, mm-hmm. but if you're going to wait till the very end of deer season and you had too many deer to begin with, all of that nutritional resource that you planted and paid for, it is getting destroyed because you have too many deer. You are degrading the amount of forage mm-hmm. that is available.
Yeah.
In that case, it would have been, from a management perspective, advantageous to take them out early in the year.
Absolutely.
So that you'd have less mouths on them late in the year, especially when you're going into winter. Mm-hmm. So I would even throw this out too, from a hunting perspective. So from a management perspective, number one, get them killed. That you got to get them off the landscape. For better management for food resources, kill them early. Mm-hmm. That way, food plots, etc., you have more fall food available. From a hunting perspective too, I think it's better to get them harvested as early as possible if you consider the human disturbance and the hunting pressure of a lot of doe killing going on during the rut or mm-hmm. during the pre-rut or something like that.
Yep.
So to me, I just come back to get it done.
Get her done.
Figure out whatever way works best for your situation, mm-hmm. but get it done.
And there's some states with DMAP programs, the one that comes to mind immediately is Arkansas. And they have, if you're in a DMAP program and the biologist recommends antlerless harvest tags, they're basically any deer tag that meets criteria. And so they're allowed to harvest antlerless deer doe during the archery season, but with a gun. It's any weapon, any deer type. Well, I may be misquoting the law, so don't go out. It's any weapon,
Yeah.
and for the approved deer.
Yeah. Yeah.
And oftentimes, it would be here. Let's get rid of our doe harvest requirement during October, well before the breeding season, and before they become too spooky. Now, the bow hunters in the group aren't going to be happy because they got a bunch of gun hunters out there whacking does.
Yeah.
But
that would be first. That's a special case scenario. That is with the oversight of your state wildlife agency giving you permission to do that and giving you special tags to do that. But your state wildlife agency or your biologist has seen you have such a need to get does off the landscape and lower the population. They're expanding the opportunity for you to do so.
That's right.
In other words, it's gotten that bad.
Yeah.
We're going to help you get this done. It's gotten that bad.
Yep, we're going to help you fix this. And I know Texas has a program too, similar to that. You can start gun hunting a month early, and next. Back in the day when I was living and managing deer in Texas, actually you could harvest during February, if I remember correctly, on the special tag.
Yeah.
So our state agencies across the U.S. are trying to facilitate effective deer management by giving landowners that participate in data collection and if you don't know what's going on, it's hard to justify doing something. But if you have data collection, working with a biologist, they're going to try to help you any way they can to meet your management goals.
Mm-hmm. And still to this day, it really blows me away that people that are so interested in antlers, just like I am, just like you are, neglect that side of management.
Yeah.
The doe harvest side of it. It's really boring, I think, to a lot of them. It's something that's been going on for so long, we neglect how important it is.
Yeah.
But it is so fundamental. Instead of looking for a new food plot species, and this is really going to tweak it, instead of, I'm going to plant some more fruit trees, all that's good. All that's great. We recommend it. It's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
But the most important thing was the most simple thing you could do, and that's reduce the number of deer.
Yeah.
On your property.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So shoot them early, shoot them often. But then another question I've gotten at numerous workshops and meetings with hunters and landowners is, what about which doe should I shoot? I'm sitting on a food plot, and I've got a doe and two fawns or one fawn, and it's out of spots. I've got another doe with one or two fawns, and they're much younger. They're spotted, and almost to a man and a hunter, they're going to say, well, I'm going to shoot the doe with the older fawn because I don't want to stress out the younger fawns. And I love telling people, no, you're doing it wrong. From my point of view, there's a potential genetic component in breeding dates. And there's a lot of things that can affect breeding dates, as demographics, sex ratio, age structure, nutrition, a lot of that stuff. But if you've got those things fixed and you have a pretty wide breeding range on a property, we've shown through our research in our pens that late-born fawns take multiple years to catch up. And so you generally don't want late fawns if you can have younger fawns. Early fawns.
Earlier born fawns.
Earlier born fawns. And a portion of that control of breeding is tied back to genetics. So the female's genetics are affecting when she breeds to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
So if you back to the scenario, you got a food plot, you've got an adult doe with, fully no longer spotted fawns and another doe with spotted fawns, I'd shoot the doe with the spotted fawns. And then when the fawns come back out to look at the body of the doe, I'd figure out which one was the doe fawn, and I'd shoot the doe fawn as well.
Yeah, that's going to generate a lot of interest there, because so many people are afraid of being harassed by everyone when they bring back a fawn.
Yeah.
People are going to make fun of them because you shot the little fawn. What's the difference? I mean, you killed a doe.
Yeah.
It's just you killed it a year earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to taste pretty darn good too.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's easier to load into the truck too. Don't hurt your back.
It's one you can do by yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, that's a valid point. In a property where you have multiple hunters, there's always going to be somebody kind of looking at you like, oh, what'd you do that for?
I can't believe you did that.
Yeah. How could you do that? And well, they just don't understand the context that, our listeners may better appreciate.
Right.
And I did point out, I said, I'm going to make sure which one is the doe fawn. Make sure it's a doe fawn. I don't want to shoot the buck fawn.
Yeah.
Because, again, some more research that we've been involved with in the past is looking at, and also that's been supported by research at the University of Georgia, is that orphaned fawns, particularly buck fawns, tend not to disperse as much as fawns that are still with their mothers. So, if you are worried about, and we've had people say, well, yeah, we get this epigenetics and this generational improvement in habitat quality, and we're going to make better deer after generations of improved nutrition, but then my buck fawns are going to leave the property.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, that's part of the cost of doing business. They disperse.
Yeah.
But if you shoot the doe, that buck fawn is going to be more apt to stay around on your property.
Yeah, there's a greater likelihood that it'll stay on your property.
Yeah.
But to me, that's also, because we get that a lot about dispersal and the epigenetic effects. I think of two ways. First of all, let's be honest, on a really, really small property, for you to increase population level diet quality is going to be really difficult.
Sure.
Because there's all these overlapping home ranges. I mean, you really, I think, need cooperation among your neighbors and to really change the diet quality for hundreds and hundreds of deer.
Yes.
Do you agree?
Absolutely.
So that is why we see it's just so much easier on some of these landscapes. And just the greatest example is if you compare the Midwest to the Southeast. It's just you're in a food-rich environment, countywide. So that's where you can see this stuff most easily. But yeah, on smaller properties, it's more of a challenge. But here's the other part of that too, Steve, is don't fall into the same trap relative to, in this argument, just like people do with buck management, with the old saying of, if I don't shoot it, my neighbor is. Well, you never get anywhere with that.
Yeah.
Because your neighbor may shoot it. Absolutely, they may. But you don't stand a chance for improvement if you have that attitude and don't let it go.
Because you're the neighbor that's shooting somebody else's deer that they passed.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that's kind of the way I view that as well.
Yep.
Okay, so what happens, Steve? You got a doe out on the food plot, and she has twin buck fawns. Lay her down. If you need to harvest does.
Yeah, because the sex of offspring is determined by the male sperm, not the female. There's no evidence that the female, well, I'm thinking humans now, the father in humans is the one that determines the sex of the child. And I'm not aware of any data research in deer to go against that generality that the male determines the gender of the offspring.
Okay, you took it to a level of complexity. I
You
wasn't
weren't
asking.
wanting to go there.
Where you're going is that is there a I shouldn't harvest that doe because there's a predisposition for her to have buck fawns. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying there isn't a predisposition
Yeah,
for
yeah.
her.
Yeah.
Now, you could argue, well, I want those fawns to be as well taken care of moving forward as possible. But by the time gun season happens in most states, those fawns are fully capable. They're off mama's milk. They might still be nuzzling her teats every once in a while, bothering her, but she's not providing much.
Yeah. They're nutritionally they're independent
Yeah.
at that point.
Absolutely, after 90 days and as early as 60 days, research in some Texas research pens years ago showed they were pretty much okay.
All right, so now we've got a scenario. So there's your scenario of buck dispersal. You've talked about harvesting the doe with young fawns versus older fawns, which would be related to the one with older fawns, since they typically come into estrus at the same time each year. She's more likely to also have fawns born early the next year.
Yeah.
And you're giving those buck fawns more time to grow. They're going to be a better yearling,
Yeah.
antler size, and maybe up to 2 years of age better, simply because they were born early. Then we talked about, you said harvesting a doe, and you know that she has a buck fawn. The positive attribute of that is that the buck fawn, more than likely, we can't say for sure, there's a greater likelihood that buck fawn will not disperse the next year and stay on that property.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about making a doe harvest decision on back to population control based on the number of fawns they have or not. So let's say you are wanting to grow the population. This might be very, very rare. You might want to grow the population. But there are some cases, like when we talked with William in the southern part of our state.
Yeah. Yep.
There are definitely some cases.
Yep. Where high quality nutrients are not available in the landscape, and you need to be very careful. And our friends in South Texas would, say, woo, no, don't shoot, don't harvest does, leave them because of the irregular fawn production.
And so now you've got 2 does on the food plot. One has fawns and one does not. And you want to grow the population, but you still need to kill a deer, let's just say. This is just an academic scenario here. But in that case, harvest the doe without a fawn.
Yeah, in that specific case, yes. But in my mind, there's no such thing as a barren doe, and she may have lost her fawns this year, but that doesn't mean that she's going to lose them next year, and she's probably going to be in better condition at breeding because she did lose her fawns, and so therefore, if she's in better condition at breeding, some of our research has shown that if you don't have that lactation demand, you can come into estrus about 5 days earlier on average than if you had 2 fawns live through weaning. So she's actually going to be in better shape to breed, and she might breed a little earlier than the other doe, even if they generally have the same breeding dates. So, boy, it comes down to...
Well, you're being Mr. Lab Coat on this one. See, I default to what I know right here and right now. Right here and right now, that mother was successful.
Yeah.
And it might not even be, Steve, it might not be relative to her condition or anything like that. The doe with 2 fawns, she, because of territoriality, she has better fawning habitat.
That's right.
Her fawn didn't get eaten by a coyote.
That's right.
So for that reason, I would spare her and shoot the doe with no fawns.
Yeah, and under the context that you're trying to grow the population.
under that context, right?
Yeah. Now, if you're in an overpopulated situation, which is, back to my survey of biologist friends of ours, 90% aren't in the case that you were talking about.
Right.
They have the other problem. So I would shoot
the one with fawns.
The one with fawns, and let the barren doe, she's not barren, she's just not this year with fawns, and she'll maybe throw a buck fawn earlier and in better shape next year.
Okay, Steve. Well, I hope anyway, we've kind of addressed the importance, the continual importance of population management. Mm-hmm. We've often talked, and our listeners likely right, we've probably talked about more often, I think we're assuming everybody buys into doe harvest.
Yeah.
I think it's just obvious to us. That's just maintenance. That's just what you have to do. And we kind of talk about in the past that let's also consider the type of buck harvest that you do mm-hmm. as another way to do that, to reduce population numbers. But the bottom line is deer population control is always of interest, at least in most areas. The areas we work with, it is. And don't neglect doe harvest.
That's right.
And that's one of the simplest things you can do. And hey, Steve, let's talk about the great number of people that lease land and they want to burn. They would love to harvest the timber. They would love to do forest stand improvement, on and on, all that stuff we talk about, but they can't.
Yeah.
It's population management, and it's really important.
That's their only can of beans.
Yeah. Okay, well, Steve, hopefully we've done it justice, so to speak. So appreciate your time today.
And as we go, as we're saying goodbye, this is middle of July right now that we're speaking, mm-hmm. and this is getting into some of the worst habitat quality in the Southeast because it's middle of summer, when we've been in a relative drought for several weeks and maybe a month or two in some places. So forage quality is declining rapidly. Fawn production is, they're depending upon where you are, there's a lot of variation, but we've got a lot of does dropping fawns right now, and that lactation demand for nutritional intake is going up. Right. Forage quality is going down. Have you, and I'm speaking to our listeners, have you been doing the things this spring and previous winter and this summer to facilitate having enough food available for the fawns that are being produced right now on your property? And if you haven't, there's about 20 podcasts that they need to listen to and then start implementing some of it for next year.
Yeah. We've said it many, many times, but we're right here in it. This is a nutritionally stressful, demanding time of the year for deer in the South, especially in the South. But this is the bottleneck. This is one of those nutritional bottlenecks for deer. And we did a lot of posts on that with social media. Mm-hmm. So we've got some good graphics, I think, there on Instagram and Facebook and stuff that kind of demonstrate the changes in the demands nutritionally this mm-hmm. time of year, especially for does. So, But now is the time. And so hopefully 3 months ago in May, you planted some warm season food plots, and your does and your fawns here in a few months are going to benefit greatly from that, from having a doe in great condition during the summer.
Yeah.
All right, Steve.
Great talking with you, Bronson, as always.
Great talking with you.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.